Welcome to Clear the Air with me, Dr. Angela Lim, medical doctor and co-founder of Clearhead, an innovative employee wellbeing platform. We get real and raw on these existential questions of mental health and well-being that's puzzled humans for millennia, and we share the science behind what you're experiencing and the answers behind those questions. Today's topic is about burnout, which is clearly on the rise. The stress of the pandemic, compounded by the stress of constant availability through remote work, has led to burnout and prompted many to reorganize their priorities. Whether it's the great resignation of 2020 or the viral TikTok trend about Gen Z quiet quitting the last couple of months, they are all a symptom of an underlying global trend that I will unpack today with our guest, Suzi McAlpine, and ensure we provide you with practical tips you can implement yourself and in the organizations that you lead. Suzi is a leadership coach who specializes in development for CEOs and executive leadership teams for large enterprise companies. Suzi is also the creator of the Leaders Map, a blended leadership program for organizations wishing to equip their emerging leaders with the necessary leadership capabilities for success. She has been featured in several media channels and is the author of the best-selling book Beyond Burnout and an award-winning blog, The Leaders Digest. Welcome, Suzi.
Kia ora, Angela. It's so lovely to be talking with you today. And hello, everybody. Hi from Nelson.
Wonderful. Well, why don't we kick it off with what is burnout?
Great question to start because I think although burnout is part of our workplace vernacular, we often say, oh my gosh, I'm so burnt out after that week from hell. True burnout is far more malevolent, it's more insidious. I like the definition that burnout is a state of physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion caused by excessive and prolonged stress to do with your professional life. It's really important that we don't demonize stress in and of itself because, in fact, a certain amount of stress is not only really good for our well being, it's really good for our performance as well. It's when that stress becomes chronic, ongoing, on-remitting over a long period of time, what I call baked into the role, that's when you're more likely to be at risk for burnout.
And I mean, as you said, sometimes stress is good as long as it's at the right levels. So when organizations get into the point where they have that chronic stress, a large proportion of their organization is experiencing burnout. What is there a cost associated with that, or does it not really matter? And it's an individual person's problem.
Yeah. So, one of the biggest myths that I came across when I first started researching and writing the book is that burnout is an individual's problem, not an organizational problem. And this is a bit like treating the sick fish when it's the water that's contaminated. We need to start looking at burnout as an organizational problem. We can't have conversations around burnout without having conversations around the culture, the ecosystem, the leadership practices of an organization. And burnout costs individuals dearly. I think anyone who's experienced burnout can really attest to that. But burnout costs organizations. In fact, Harvard Business Review came out recently and estimated that the cost of burnout is between 125 and 190 billion dollars in healthcare spending alone. And Gallup also showed recently that burnt out employees are costing just under $3,500 per $10,000 of salary. And this is because of things like that burnout causes things like absenteeism, presenteeism, a lack of engagement, turnover, and even lack of productivity. So, burnout is absolutely a problem for the individual, but it's very much a problem for organizations and even broader societies. And as you mentioned earlier, burnout was on the rise before COVID hit. We can't blame COVID for all of our burnout woes, but it has certainly increased. If you look at all of the research that's coming out, I haven't seen one study which has said that it's gone down. In fact, since the pandemic, unfortunately, burnout is on the rise. So I think that if we can start to look at burnout through an organizational lens as well as an individual lens, then that's where we're going to be able to make some big changes.
Yeah, I agree with you. And we know we see that data consistent in the Clearhead platform as well in terms of people reporting burnout as a cause of their challenges, wanting to find that balance, right? And I think ultimately as humans, we tell and learn from stories, and burnout is something that's actually very close to home for you. And so, would you like to share maybe a little bit about your story around what does burnout mean to you personally and what's got you in this journey today?
Yeah. So, having worked with thousands of leaders and as an executive coach, I have had a front row seat to lots of burnt out leaders and individuals across the years. But the first time I came up close and personal with this concept of burnout was back in 2008. From the outside, it looked like I had it all. My life was awash with professional pinnacles and shiny badges of success. I think my friends used to call me Super Susie, and I wore that badge with honour, even though it weighed me down a little bit. I had recently just returned early from parental leave. My youngest child of I have three children, and at that time she was just shy of 5 months old, and I had come back to lead a division of the world's largest executive search and HR consulting firm through the global financial crisis. And every morning I would jumble the kids into the back seat of the car and, baby spittle on my crisp navy suit, and I'd careen out of the driveway and hurl the kids into their respective daycares and schools, and then hurtle on into Auckland CBD to have some sort of bigwig meeting to find to find an executive search assignment for a CEO or such like. And I remember it was a Tuesday morning, and as I pulled up outside of my son's school, Nicholas, he was 7 at the time, he turned to me from the back seat of the car, and his voice was quivering and his little bottom lip was quavering. And he turned to me and he said, "Mummy, can I please have a hug?" Now, this was a really big deal for Nicholas. He was, had recently been diagnosed with Asperger's. So for him to reach out and ask for some physical affection was quite a big deal. He'd been struggling at school a little bit. And I remember just thinking, gosh, that's just another thing on my long list of to do items. And when he asked me this, his voice, sort of his words didn't compute. I remember looking through the back seat of, the back window of the car, my mind racing about this presentation I had to give in half an hour. And I answered in a really clipped, stressed, rushed out tone, "No, I don't have time." And I shoved him and his little backpack onto the sidewalk, and I drove off. And the look in my son's eyes to this day haunts me. I mean, he's fine, he's forgiven me. But needless to say, a few minutes later, I was on the side of the road in absolute tears, mixing in with my baby spittle, thinking, what is wrong with me that I don't have the capacity to hug somebody, one of the most important people in my life. And what I didn't realize at the time, and neither did my boss, was that I was demonstrating one of the clear symptoms of burnout, which is depersonalization and distancing. And so began my journey, which has led me, many years later to research and write this book called Beyond Burnout. Because I think that if my boss and I had been more aware of some of those symptoms, we might have been able to, you know, avoid my Nicholas no hug moment. So, as well as researching and writing a book, and obviously coaching a lot of executives through burnout, I've experienced it myself. It was a felt experience. So that's my story.
Thanks for sharing and for being so vulnerable, right? And I think actually, women and minorities face that in a higher number, for the very reason that we take on a lot more load than sort of the average person. And so, and we also as women tend to have this tendency of wanting to feel that we have to do it all. Yes, we want our career, but we also have to be the great mom, and we have to put dinner on the table, and we have to pick all the kids up on time, and we put all that pressure on us. And then the only release valve is moments like that when you have to pull yourself on the side of the road and just release with crying. But that's not a sustainable way of living, and we have this facade that we put on with others. So, you briefly touched on it, which is that actually there are signs that people show when they are experiencing burnout, and that as leaders, as colleagues, as friends, as family, we can actually all do our bit by being aware of what those signs are so that we can reach out and ask people, are they okay, and whether they need some help. And maybe that was the only time they've ever been asked that. So share with us, Suzi, what are the common signs that affects people with burnout that allows you to know that maybe this person's going through it?
So there are three red flags, is what I call them, or symptoms of burnout, and these were originally coined by probably, arguably, the world's leading experts on burnout, Christina Maslach and Michael Leiter. So the first red flag or symptom of burnout is chronic exhaustion. This is when the batteries won't recharge, you lose your bounce back factor. It's when you feel exhausted all of the time or some of the time. It's when that holiday won't do its trick. In fact, one of the sort of red flags is you might go on holiday, you take a break, and you come back and you're just as exhausted as before you left. I think we can all identify with times where we've got to dig deep. We might have to work, longer hours. There's a period of intense activity, but it subsides. So we're talking about chronic exhaustion, that always or nearly always exhausted. So that's the first sign. The second red flag or symptom of burnout is increased cynicism and depersonalization. So the increased cynicism is when things that didn't used to get under your skin suddenly really frustrate the heck out of you. You've kind of got a what's the point? You've got increased cynicism, you're disillusioned, you're frustrated. So you start to see a real rise, a short fuse, if you like. And the depersonalization really talks to a sort of almost a distancing from people and things that you would normally lean into. My Nicholas No Hug moment was an example of that. So that's the second red flag. The third red flag or symptom of burnout is reduced professional efficacy. So this is when you're digging deeper, you're working harder, but suddenly you don't feel like you're getting ahead. Things that you used to be able to do really easily, tasks, suddenly seem to take Herculean effort, and you just feel like you're not performing. And this can be self fulfilling, because we do know that burnout has impacts on our cognitive and our emotional processes, and so it has impacts. Somebody I interviewed for the book said it's a bit like running a marathon in molasses, and I think that's a really good sign. So three red flags or symptoms: chronic exhaustion, increased cynicism or depersonalization, and reduced professional efficacy. What I would say is that if you suspect or recognize some of these in yourself or someone that you're leading, hold your assumptions lightly. And certainly if you do think, oh, I might be experiencing these sound a little bit too familiar, do go and see your GP, do go and see a professional medical person to check it out, because it could be burnout, but it could be something else. But I think if organizations and leaders in particular can start to get a bit more au fait and aware of some of these three symptoms, then we're more likely to catch it early.
Yeah, those are very clear things that we can definitely identify, especially as people start behaving in manners that they currently don't. And I think, just to kind of really stress the importance of this, you never want to get to this point, because what we see is that you might be experiencing burnout, let's just say for 6 months, but you might be needing a whole year to recover. It always takes longer for you to recover and feel like you're back to yourself. So you never want to get to that tipping point where you're experiencing burnout. So I just really want to flag that, any early signs of these symptoms, it's ask for help, take a break, highlight to your managers that you're not coping, and all that kind of stuff. So
Really good point.
yeah, and I think we talked about basically the manifestation of burnout, but do you have any insights working with all these high performing individuals, working in these organizations, what actually causes burnout?
Yeah, it was really interesting when I did the research. So Christina Maslach and Michael Leiter, who I mentioned, they identified 6 causes of burnout, and these have been brought out in subsequent research. So there are 6 causes of burnout. The first one is one that we generally associate with burnout, and that's overwork. So I just don't have the resources that are required to carry out the work. And overwork can be caused by a lack of prioritization or clarity. It can be caused by a culture of overwork. It can be excessive working hours, unpredictable workflow, unrealistic deadlines. So these are the causes of overwork. But there are 5 other causes of burnout, and some of them may surprise you. So, the second cause of burnout is a lack of control. I think as humans, one of the worst feelings we have is a lack of control, and of course, this has been exacerbated during COVID pandemic. And a lack of control can be caused by things like not having a say in how our work is carried out. So, not being involved in the how and the why of our work. It can be caused by no influence, little or no influence over decisions that affect us. It can be, having to have accountability without power, or even not being able to work from our strengths. These things can really add to a lack of control. The third cause of burnout is isolation. And isolation can be caused at the workplace, can be caused by a raft of things. It can be microaggressions due to race or gender. It can be excessive politics or bullying behaviour. It can even be a lack of psychological safety and trust within a group or a team that you are part of. And so that can be really sort of cause that isolation. The fourth cause of burnout is an absence of fairness. So this can be caused by things like a lack of absence of an absence of fairness when it comes to things like pay, perks, prestige, promotion, even whether your voice is getting heard in meetings or not. And so those are really, really important things to be aware of. The fifth cause of burnout is insufficient reward. Now, when we talk about insufficient reward, most of us go straight to financial rewards, right? I'm not getting paid enough for what I'm putting in. But more often than not, insufficient rewards can be what we call intrinsic rewards. Things like, do I feel like my direct manager genuinely cares about me? And we know that one of the biggest causes of burnout and influence is our direct manager. So the poor leadership practices can actually really affect burnout. It can be, when we're talking about insufficient reward, it can be, do I feel genuinely valued by the organization that I work for? The final and sixth cause of burnout is a mismatch of values, or a real mismatch between my own personal values and that the values of the organization. And what this means is that over time, if there's a real values mismatch, I'm constantly having to make trade-offs between my own personal values and that of the organization. So any one of these causes can lead to burnout. But if you have several at play, or all of those at once, cue burnout storm. So I think one of the most important things for organizations and leaders in particular is to start to go, well, which one of these 6 causes, or which of these 6 causes might we be at risk of for ourselves and our employees?
Yeah, and actually, when you list all of those things, the reality is it's probably a combination of of a lot of them, and it is, if it is a combination of all of them, it can be very overwhelming for leaders to be able to actually address all of them. Especially if you're a small company, you might not have the resources. So, I think that's a really nice segue to talk about. I think you said there are 4 key strategies across individual, team, and organizational wide level on what we can do when an organization is experiencing burnout and its people. Would you like to kind of share some of the learnings that you've done in your research?
Yes, so I think if you suspect that burnout may be happening within your organisation, if you're a leader, I'll reiterate: look at those six causes and get really curious, get under the hood, and go, which one of these might be most, you know, at play. And then, but when we start to think about what can we do to, spot it and stamp it out, there are four strategies which I came up with: recognize, destigmatize, socialize, and organize. I think I came up with the first two quite easily, and then I had to have, one time I was thinking what could be the others, and I had a glass of wine. Went, oh, here's socialize and organize. So I'll talk to you a little bit about it. As I mentioned first, that we can't address a problem if it remains hidden. And so if organizations can get better at recognize, and leaders can get better at recognizing those three symptoms, and there are some really practical strategies on how to do that in the book. If you're a larger organization, or if you're in an organization which is features in the burnout statistics and not in a good way, I'm talking about professions such as the legal profession, the healthcare profession, the teaching profession, the health human services professions. All of these professions feature more highly in burnout rates. You may want to, or if you're a larger organization, you may want to look at something like the Maslow burnout inventory, which measures burnout across a whole spectrum. So that's the first strategy, is recognize. The second strategy, which can be applied at a leadership, individual, and organizational level, is destigmatize. So Brene Brown said, shame never drives positive behavior. And like a lot of mental distress in the workplace, burnout is shrouded in shame. People are, and stigma. People are too afraid a lot of the time to put their hand up and say, actually, I'm overwhelmed, I'm really struggling, because they're afraid it's a career limiting move. And so I think one of the things we need to do is start to create better, uh, you know, e- safer conversations for people to do that. And that's going to look different in different organizations. One of the main things that leaders can do is have the courage to be vulnerable. If you've had experiences with stress, go first and talk about your own experiences if you have. The third strategy is called socialize. So we need to get better at and being more purposeful about creating social connection within our organizations. I think, when I work with lots of organizations, we're having lots of what are we doing conversations. So conversations around tasks and projects and milestones and the work, the tasks. That's fine. And that's really good, because otherwise nothing gets done in organizations. But we also have an opportunity, I think, in most organizations to have more how are we going conversations. And this might look like, perhaps it's the beginning of a team meeting, and the leader starts with, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, let's just do a quick check in. How's your well-being? On a scale of 1 to 10, I'll go first. It might be in a one-on-one with your direct report saying, I know the last month or so has been really tough. What's been a highlight and a low light for you? It can look like active listening. So, and how many times do we go, hi, how are you? Good, great, and off we go. So there's something really powerful about not only leaders but individuals when it comes to socialize, is just being fully present and listening deeply, not to solve the problem, not to wait for you to finish talking so I can reply, but just full presence and active listening. It seems such a simple thing, but these are ways that we can create that. The fourth strategy is prioritize. Organize. And so this really looks at how can an organization or a team, or a leader or an individual organize better, work better. It might look like, how do we get better at prioritizing? I was talking to an executive leadership team recently, and they said, here's our 15 priorities for the organization. And I said, well, that kind of makes an oxymoron of the word priorities. So it's, what can we ditch? What can we delay? Can we make a to don't list at an organizational level? It might look like reducing the pebbles in people's shoes, which is sort of like the red tape and bureaucracy that litters most organizations. It can be getting better at delegation. creating clarity around task. All of those things fall under the organized strategy. So recognize, destigmatize, socialize, and organize. And in the book, I go through lots of practical applications. But that's a really good start if organizations want to really start to address burnout in their organizations.
That's really great. I love the example you brought up about active listening. We have multiple tools on Clearhead actually to help people learn how to be active listeners, both either as leaders or as someone supporting someone with mental health, or even just learning how to kind of take space for themselves as well. So it's such a key skill that we can build as part of our resilience toolkit, basically, and how we can be a better safety network for our communities. That's really great. Look, I was a medical doctor. I left the hospital because I was tired of it being sort of this illness model, and I wanted to do more preventative, being the fence at the top of the cliff rather than the ambulance at the bottom. So I'd love to hear from you around what have you seen leaders or organizations that have been able to build a well-being culture, maybe as a preventative aspect of not getting their organizations to a point of burnout.
Well, one of the things that I'm seeing trends, which I think is a really good thing, is that well-being is taking its rightful place in many organizations as a key strategic pillar. And if you look at the research, making well-being a priority, a key strategic pillar for an organization, it's not only the right thing to do for your people, right? It actually makes good business sense. And there's some really fascinating articles and research around those organizations who really make well-being a priority, a key strategic pillar, not only perform on almost every health metric, whether that's engagement, turnover, productivity. We're talking about the Great Resignation, retention, and even profitability. I think one of the first things at an organizational level is to do that and to have well-being championed at the highest levels. We're talking CEO and board level and modeled. So not relegating it to HR. I think that's a real trap. Oh, look, we'll just give well-being to the people function. No, the best organizations, they are modeling it right at the top levels. They are seeing that this is that well-being is a responsibility for leaders right throughout the organization, not only to champion but to model, because the best way we can influence others is to model the behavior that we want to see. And the other thing that I'm seeing is that the best organizations who are doing really well when it comes to well-being is they're not playing lip service to it. They're not dancing around the edges of well-being. Like, here's a yoga class, here's a resilience class. um, you know Burnout's not going to be solved by a fruit bowl in a lunchroom. These are the icing on the cake. They are not the cake. And I get a bit frustrated when you see people, when I see organizations kind of dancing around the edges. These things are important, but they're not enough on their own. What I see the best organizations doing is rather looking at those 6 root causes, looking at the ecosystem, the culture, the leadership practices around well-being right throughout the organization, and making those root causes less in terms of burnout, and starting to do proactive things. That's sort of like in the water. I talked about treating burnout like an individual problems, like treating the sick fish when it's the water that's contaminated. And so the best organizations are looking at what can we do to create clear water to start off with. And sometimes it can be really simple practices. So developing leadership capability. As I mentioned earlier, there is a direct link between well-being and burnout and poor leadership practices, but really good leadership practices can really buffer against burnout. So it's kind of those sorts of things which I think are the most important.
I love it. I am all about addressing the root causes. And I mean, I think it is hard, right? Like, the causes that you've identified is very difficult to actually really go beyond, like you said, the lip service or the surface level stuff. And there is actually a lot of entrenched pushback that will come from, people feeling defensive as well, and I think what we're really trying to say here is, like, we're not blaming anyone. Often these things are wider systemic culture. It's not one person that's magically making all of this bad. And so having data as a way of using it in terms of influencing people to be all on the same page, like, this is important for us, this is how it's affecting our people, and being able to do something about it, I think is a core part of, like, why Clearhead exists, to provide that sort of very powerful data analytics so that you can drive that culture change and you address those root causes. I think, like you said, you've hinted at a lot of this is about leadership, and you are a leadership coach. So, talk us through sort of maybe a broader piece around what makes good leaders and how do you foster that leadership in organization?
Well, I think that great leadership is context specific in a lot of ways. What makes a great leader in one context or time may look quite different in another context. I mean, look at Winston Churchill. He was seen as a great wartime leader and perhaps less so following that. But I have seen, having worked with thousands and thousands of leaders, there are certain traits or skills or characteristics, I think, that come up a time and time again with the best leaders that I've seen. The first is self awareness. So some of the best leaders I've ever worked with, they're really self aware and they're on a continuing journey to build their self awareness. And when I talk about self awareness, there's two aspects of that. There is, I guess, looking in the mirror and looking internally. So, what are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? What are my values, and how can I lead by those? What lights me up? Those sorts of things. But it doesn't stop there. So, self awareness is also about, you know, it's not only how do I see the world, but how does the world see me? So the best leaders are continually getting data points. They're asking and seeking feedback, sometimes hard feedback from those they lead about how they get in their own way, their weaknesses. What do I need to stop doing? What can I do? So self awareness is the first thing that I see a lot of in the best leaders. The second is that the best leaders I know genuinely care about their people. Um, they don't play lip service to it. It's what Mark Crowley calls heart-centered leadership, and I think, or servant leadership. If you don't genuinely care about the people that you are leading and you view them as a human resource, I don't like that term. I think that's a question, should you be in a leadership role. So the best leaders, they're really heart-centered. They demonstrate empathy, they demonstrate compassion. That is the second thing. They lead by their values, is the third thing. So the best leaders I know, they've been quite purposeful about going, what are my values? And it's why I included in one of my exercises in the leaders map. What are those things that are really important to me? So one of them for me is whānau first, and it can help with decision making. And an example of this was recently I had an opportunity to work with this an amazing group of people who I loved and respected, and the project was going to be very financially rewarding, but it meant that I was going to have to be away from home. Traveling way more. Now, I have a 13-year-old daughter. She doesn't think she needs me, but she totally does. And to say yes to this opportunity meant that I wasn't living by my values, which was whānau first. So the best leaders I know, that they identify their values, they live and lead by their values, they hold themselves to account to values, which can be uncomfortable, because you're not always going to be able to do it. And perhaps finally, the best leaders I know and things to cultivate is courage. Courage to risk, to be vulnerable, which might look like admitting when you've made a mistake, the courage to try new things, to have difficult conversations with heart and compassion with those that you lead. So you can't be a leader without having to have courage. So those are some of the I think the best leadership traits to develop and cultivate.
And I think this is a really great moment to also remind people around this whole thing around, you got to put the life jacket on yourself first before you can put it on anyone else. If you remember right at the beginning, we talked about the signs of burnout as depersonalization. You will lose your ability to care even if you genuinely really care for people. So you as a leader is a fundamental part of preventing burnout in the organization. So you need to make sure that you take care of yourself and you know what your limits are, and also what you don't, what most people often discount is the impact of role modeling from senior execs and leaders when they are practicing the values and the well-being strategy that they sort of socialize and communicate to the organization. That is the most effective way in which you will see other parts of the organization actually implementing those change.
I
So
so
maybe just,
I
oh,
yeah, sorry,
sorry.
I was just going to add to that. I just wanted to say brava to what you just said, Angela. Um, and I think that often leaders underestimate the shadow they cast. You know, when you whisper, it comes out like a shout. And so modeling those practices and those well-being practices like exercise and sleep and making those a priority, those sorts of things, or taking breaks or leaving the office, or if you're going on holiday, switching off the email, or cutting that down, not sending emails at all hours of the night unless it's an absolute emergency. I think that it's such an important point that we need to, when it comes to well-being, we really need to model that if we want our teams and others to see that it's okay to do that too. So I just want to say, um, you know, that's such a good point. I so agree.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Susie, you've worked with a lot of great organizations. Give us a case study. You can name or not name them, up to you. But yeah, I'd love to hear what you've seen. I think everyone often knows that they need to do this, but it's super hard. And I want to just acknowledge it is hard. Can you talk us an example of where an organization was and where they are today, and the steps they took to get there and how long it took? Just give us a little bit of the nitty gritty of, like, what this really looks like in the real world in terms of implementation.
So I won't name names, but one quite large organisation that I've worked with for many years has really been on a journey, not only when it comes to well-being, but also leadership, and leadership development, because the two are inextricably linked. And I think one of the most important things that they did was that they got sign off from the board at board level, and the CEO really championed this. And this was before well-being was trendy, about the importance of well-being, and so that they really did see it as one of the key four strategic pillars. And they made a plan over 3 or 4 years, or even 5 years, I think it was. So they looked at it, they made it a priority, and they put their money where their mouth was when it came to that. The second thing that this organization has done is that they've realized it as a journey. So you can feel pretty overwhelmed if you think, oh, we have to do it all at once. And so they recognized that well-being, it's not a marathon, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And so they were really clear at going, well, what is the priority, that what's the one or two priorities in the space this year, and what else have we got going on? So they paced themselves. They did one or two things around well-being at one time. And then the third thing they did is well, actually, there were a couple of others. They really invested in leadership. So even though this was at the beginning of COVID, and organizations were having to really cut costs, and in a lot of, they worked within their circle of control, and they really invested in leadership development. They They didn't go, oh, look, we're just going to pull back. They recognize that in their organization, a lot of leaders are thrust into positions of leadership without people leadership, without the tools and skills and training to do so. So they really invested in supporting their leaders, particularly their emerging leaders and first time leaders, to be skilled in some of these practices like giving and receiving feedback and coaching and delegation and managing performance, all of these sorts of things. Um, and I think also the final thing that they did was that they looked at little touch points, around well-being throughout, from an onboarding perspective. They didn't just shove things on the intranet and go, well, there you go, there it is. They started to really socialize the importance of well-being. So off the top of my head, they've seen some huge gains in terms of engagement. um, sorry, I forgot another thing. They got really good at prioritizing, which I alluded to, but they started to look at red tape and bureaucracy and double ups and what I talk about, those pebbles in people's shoes. And they were really surprised at when they did that in teams, what came up. It was like, oh my God, we're doubling up on this. This is a real pebble in people's shoes. And they involved their employees in this. They didn't come up with all the answers. They said, well, what would work? What is most important to you? So, that makes sense. So that's what they did. And they've seen some wonderful gains. They're on a journey, but all of the metrics really demonstrate that approach was a really good one to take.
Yeah, and we're on a journey ourselves as well. And I want to just flag that, it, with the data that we're seeing on Clearhead is that, yes, there are 6 different reasons for why people experience burnout in the organization, but overwork is still one of the highest cause. And so being able to make sure that you're putting the systems in place, and prioritization is one that, at Clearhead, we are really trying to do as well. We're a small team trying to do big things and, transform the way that, mental health support is delivered and ensure that it's equitable and accessible in a timely manner. We're such a small team doing and serving such great employers across New Zealand. But what it's taught me is that I need to kind of be really clear as a leader around, okay, yes, I've just dumped 10 things on your plate, but, if we only just do these 2 things, that's a win, and then everything else you can chip away at it as well. So it's really important, this prioritization piece as well. I just want to flag that that's as a leader, that's your role. And also I just want to highlight the bit that you mentioned, Suzi, around getting buy-in at a board level, and that's where some of that data piece can also be really helpful. If your board's actually asking as part of accountability, show me the data around what's causing what's causing poor well-being in our organization. Are we making a difference? Are we moving the needle? And having objective data is a great way to start that conversation and get everybody aligned that they're going the right direction. So Suzi, how can one approach the difficult or scary task of pointing out to your leaders that their leadership practices need improvement, especially when people are building ecosystems rather than ecosystems?
Yeah, carefully. um, I think that's such a great question. So, once again, if you are a people leader on this call, understand that people that you lead, hierarchical power is real, right? And people are more afraid than you think to speak up, to challenge you, to question you, to give you feedback, especially what I call redirectional or negative feedback. So if you are a people leader, make it safe, make it a positive experience for people to give you this feedback. So that's my first point to the leaders. If you to answer your question, one of certainly if there are engagement surveys in your organisation, and they have those 360-degree feedback surveys or those engagement surveys, really participate, really give constructive feedback, and come up with ideas. If it's on a one-on-one, let's say you have a direct manager and you're thinking, crikey, there's some things that you're doing that are getting in the way of our working relationship or me bringing my thing, I think often the best way is to start with process. So you might, if you have a one-on-one, or you might say to your leader, is to start by saying, oh, look, feedback is really important. I really value your feedback to me about when I'm doing well, and when how I could improve. And so I'm really keen to do that. And I'm guessing that you would also like, over the times when you want me to give you that feedback upwards, and that's can always be a bit scary. So how can we start to build into our working relationship? What do you want me to do if I feel frustrated, or how do you want me to give feedback if I feel that there's an opportunity for us to improve our working relationship? Um, there's a great agenda item which I always say is, what do you want me to keep doing, stop doing, start doing? And that can be, and so you can gently suggest, how can we apply that for both of our working relationships? So that's one of them. And I think I have on my Leaders Digest blog, how to give feedback upwards is one thing. So those are two ways to do so. um, I wouldn't attack a person. I wouldn't, feedback is important. You might say, there's the SBI model of feedback. This was the situation, this was the behavior, and this was the impact. So, but I think setting up a relationship or a process between you and your direct manager on how are we going to give and receive feedback to each other first before you give the feedback would be one place to start.
Yeah, and I also kind of want to highlight that, even if you are a leader that generally is super open to getting feedback, you might think that you're doing really well in that, and you might be very empathetic and you genuinely care about your people. It can still be very scary. I mean, from our side as well, being a small company, I have a few of my team reporting to me, the CEO, and one of the things that I had to learn was that, even though I have these weekly one-on-ones with them and say, please tell me anything I can do to be a better leader, it doesn't always float to me. So one of the things is really recognizing the importance of putting alternative systems. So, making sure that if your organization genuinely cares about listening from your team, having alternative ways in which these team members can share their feedback. Maybe it's not their direct manager that they're sharing with, but maybe someone else that is the recognized person that they go to for anything that they need to share that's not going to be directly managed by them. So I think just thinking about having systems in place that goes beyond just like my direct report will come directly to me, because there is a lot of perception. Even if you're constantly communicating, I'm not scary, I promise I'm not scary. um, so, there, do you have any sort of research around, that will help leaders really, go beyond sort of the statistics that you quoted at the beginning of the talk, and really genuinely, like we know from the research is stats don't often influence change. They're probably like, it's when you're already there, they're like, okay, cool, that's the additional push. And it's the stories, and that's why I kind of really got you to share your story and why this matters. But what else have you seen works in terms of influencing organizations or leaders to actually genuinely take this next step around changing the culture, addressing the root causes of burnout?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things when I was started researching and writing the book was that there really wasn't, very much or very little or none at all research that was based on Australia and New Zealand. And so I engaged Kogo Research, and Kogo did a whole lot of research across Australia and New Zealand. They did a study, which we use extensively in the book, about New Zealand and Australian statistics and research around burnout. A big shout out. We're really lucky. Dr. Jared Ha from AUT. You may have seen him on the news, and I'm doing another webinar panel with him for Mental Health Awareness Week. Dr. Jared Ha and his team have done some really good research around New Zealand specific rates around burnout. One of the interesting points that I was really curious about is he's actually looked at rates of burnout in minority groups, in particular Maori and Pacifica. So Google his stuff there. So if you want some more local local research to help your cause, I would look there. If you're looking at influencing up, think about who you are influencing, those individuals, and because each individual has different ways that they are influenced. Some leaders are very much influenced by, tell me the facts, tell me logic, give me research, give me data points. Others might be, what's the latest? I'm often, what's the latest trend? Others might be more influenced by personal stories. I think a combination of both is, so if you are trying to influence up in your organization around the importance of this and what we can do, take into consideration who are they influenced by, what are they influenced by, and then find those data points or stories to make sure that you're hitting the mark in terms of influencing. If you are experiencing burnout, and I dedicate a whole chapter to this in the book, practice self-compassion. I think is really important. Do check out your GP. Start to work within your circle of control. So identify what within in the situation is worth my control. You don't have to leave your job, your role. There may be opportunities to co-create some solutions for you, for the organisation, for the leader. If you can, if it's safe to do so, really start to have those conversations with your boss, and realise that making rest a priority is not. It's not indulgent. Back to that comment around best leaders is we've, yes, we've got to think about work as really important, but rest and recuperation actually helps us work better. And my own personal experiences these days, I probably have more rest. I have more, time for reflection rather than being on that hamster wheel. And ironically, it's, I'm the most successful I've been in my professional career. So it's not an either or, it's an and. So yeah, and if nothing else, just reach out and listen to somebody today. It's one of the most powerful and wonderful things we can do in our organisations. Just be fully present and listen. So, on that note, thank you so much for listening to me, Angela. You've been such an amazing podcast host, so skilled. So,
Oh,
and
thank
thanks
you.
also to Ollie, who's in the background.
Yeah, well, Susie, look, I think as you have correctly pointed out, you don't have to struggle alone. And I want to remind most people who are listening, your organization will almost certainly have an EAP program or employee assistance program where you can tap into funded support. Clearhead is one of them. If you use us, you can, and hopefully you can on Clearhead you can search for someone who is an expert on supporting people with burnout, and so you can request an appointment very easily. But look, don't struggle alone. Ask for help. Ask for help early. Identify those around you who you care about, and make sure that they feel that they can ask for help as well. So with that, I wish you all a very burnout-free week. and and thank you again, Susie, for being a part of our show today. And I wish you all a very lovely day. Take
Thank
care.
you. Thank
Bye.
you, everybody. Take care.